so excited to be with Emi Ferguson, a fabulous, let's see, flutist, composer, and vocalist. Anything else in there? What a wonderful combination of things that you do to be spontaneous with creating sound.
Totally. No, it's fun.
Which came first?
Well, I guess just making sound came first. But I don't know, I started the flute when I was 6, but I was singing before that and making stuff up before that. So depending on what point you consider any of those things actual pursuits, but we're doing it from a really young age, so it's fun.
Yeah, like a really natural part of your life,
Yeah.
just being creative. We were Paul and Daisy Soros fellows together.
Yeah.
I think different years, and then we went to Juilliard, but then didn't meet each other there
I
either,
know, it's just crazy.
and finally ended up in the same neighborhood in New York.
Yes, the best one. Like almost on the same block. I love it.
And you are actively performing in a wide spectrum of styles, like a lot of Baroque, but then also a lot of contemporary. Like, do you mix the way that you approach sound in those different worlds?
Oh yeah, I mean, for me, that's so important that it doesn't matter sort of when the music comes from, it can always be a useful sort of color in your palette to be able to employ in any different setting. And of course, so many pieces take inspiration from different things, so you have all these different things that you can pull and draw from to try and create the most effective color that you can as a performer.
Mhm. Now, with let's say a historical performance of string music, you get a lot more give in the bows that they use historically. So when you're using a Baroque instrument for flute, what is the gain? What are you gaining?
Oh, well, it's really interesting because the modern flute is completely designed to play evenly, like the modern piano. It's truly a equal temperament instrument. It's great at chromatic scales. Every note should be even and equal, and that's sort of how we're taught as modern flute players to try and have equality for all of the notes. But on a historical instrument, it's the opposite is true. Every single key has its own character because of the way that the fingerings are, which are very different to a modern instrument. Certainly for me with like some Bach sonatas, it has opened me up to completely different interpretations when I went and played it on a Baroque flute than how I had played it on a modern flute, just because the instrument responds so differently and gives you so many different things to play with. This is a Baroque flute. So this is kind of like a Bach handle era um, instrument. And so you can see that it only has one key and then it has these 6 holes here. We have got the key because we finger can't reach, but the holes are placed where they have to be for the scale of the instrument, but also, that's where your fingers are going to go. So all of the notes, you control. And if you have all your fingers covering a hole or just one up, one up, one up like this, you've got a consistent solid tube with no leaks in it, essentially. You can think of it kind of like a garden hose, where if you want the strongest water stream, you don't want to have any holes where things are leaking. But if I play in a key that requires me to vent a hole earlier up on the tube, that means I've got air leaking out. And as a result, the volume of the instrument gets cut significantly on those notes. And often the intonation gets a little bit wonky too. So you're constantly playing with these different things so that in a key like D major, which is a really good key because we have no leaks on any of the notes.
Low. Historically tuned, so it's like half a step lower.
Yeah, this is at 415, which, isn't really historical, to be quite frank. Historical was it changed depending on what town you were in, but today we have 415 as the average, so that when we're playing Baroque music, at least we can all kind of agree on something that was closer to what they had, but not necessarily what people were playing on. But that's like your D major. But if I just go up a half step to E flat major, and then E major, but then D major again. They all exhibit such different characters that I think it gave composers um, so much to work with in terms of what inspiration they were using as they were writing. Because on the modern flute, here's D major, E flat, E. They're supposed to sound the same. And of course, the chromatic scale. We could do really fast, really evenly, but on a Baroque flute, a chromatic scale. I mean, they're not true half steps, which is why in a lot of Baroque music, you don't have a lot of chromatic melodic writing unless it's quite slow. While the harmony can be quite chromatic, and Bach is especially very chromatic in his harmony. He's rarely chromatic for a flute in the melody. So you start to see that change as you get to Mozart, where there's a lot more chromatic scales going on because the instrument at that time had more keys that were able to do those chromatic bends and keep it in tune and stable.
Hmm. Great. And so the colors that you're talking about, for instance, the D major having this nice warm sound, does that translate to all the other instruments in the ensemble? Is that the same for every instrument?
I think every instrument has like slightly different tendencies in the different keys, and I can't speak to them. Flute players tend to prefer sharp keys. Oboe players, I think, tend to prefer flat keys.
Hmm.
And so, if you're looking at the circle of fifths, the flute players are going to want to go to the right, and the oboe players will want to go to the left. But we really don't like to go on a Baroque instrument more than, four flats, four sharps. That's about as far around the circle of fifths as you're going to get on a wind instrument.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. That's great. So this piece that I'm looking at with my piano class this week, it's Minuet from Tombeau de Couperin by Ravel, and he's just being enjoying the sounds of Baroque French Baroque music.
Right.
Um, and so as a pianist, we have to kind of borrow the ideas, the inspiration from other instruments, so that not everything we play is just like hitting a mechanical key, but that there's some sort of a difference in the approach of the key and the release of the key. So
Mm-hmm.
if you were looking at this melody, what are the decisions that you have to make as a flutist?
Well, I think the first thing is just seeing that it's in 3/4. As modern musicians, we often discount actually how important time signatures are in terms of giving us the feel of the music, because there's so much embedded in the time signature from dance history. And all of Baroque music really owes its origins to dancing. And so the 3/4, the fact that it's a minuet is going to give us like a really good idea, especially because Ravel here is sort of mimicking his idea of what Baroque music is. So thinking about it, looking at the time signature and thinking about it from a dance perspective, like what would this feel like if you're moving your body, and especially your feet? Where are you going to lift? Where are you going to put it down? How do these beats sort of relate to each other, and how do the measures relate to each other? And luckily Ravel kind of puts it in for you with some of the phrase markings. Um, but I think there's also some stuff that's a little bit obscured even with his phrase markings. Um, but I think you look at it, it's like measures of four. The minuet is generally in groups of four, like two and two. And that would sort of be the first thing. If I were looking at this purely as a French Baroque piece, but given that Ravel gives us something different, you kind of have a slightly different shape. But one might sort of play around with, okay, well, really, which phrase does this third beat belong to, even though it's under the slur marking um, for the, I mean, this is also unfair, I think, because I'm looking at these as slur markings rather than, I don't know if you, how you would all look at them, whether it's sort of pedal markings or connection markings.
So I'm looking at it as places where you lift. And there are not that many places in here versus when the oboe orchestration comes in, just, one bar slurs. And I was curious to ask you as a wind player, what does that signify? Like, do you lift much more often?
Rather than,
Yeah. So the interesting thing is in the piano version, he doesn't give us that little lift.
well, I mean, I think it's also interesting to look in the English horn, clarinet, and bassoon parts, and he's also got that dash, over that. That means that he's looking for a little bit more of an emphasis on the second beat.
Right.
So, and in the, let's just take a peek at the original piano. That's not there either. So perhaps he just wanted to have a little bit more of that feeling of stepping on that second beat. Because even in the first measure,
Mm-hmm.
there are a few dances that focus on the second beat, and it's kind of fun that he's playing with that as well here. So perhaps that was just to accentuate it a little bit more um, in
Yeah. Which I think,
orchestration.
it's fun for us on the keyboard then to be able to take that in and, play around with that as another option. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and Ravel kind of gives you that license by doing this orchestration himself, right? Like
Mhm.
it's really fun to see how composers change their opinions when they take a piece that they've written and sort of reorchestrate it or change it, because it shows you that there are so many possible ways to interpret it, which
Yeah.
I think gives us a lot more agency and freedom. So,
Right.
I,
Now, when you're blowing into a woodwind instrument, you need a certain amount of air to make the sound happen, right? So it's not like when you're bowing, you can kind of sneak in from nowhere. So how does that control play into how you think about starting a note?
well, it's very different depending on what woodwind instrument you're playing. So if you just think about these instruments that we even have in just the score here, the way that these instruments make sound, the flutes, you're blowing over, essentially like a bottle. If you've ever done that. An oboe, you've got a double reed. It's very, very small, and it uses a lot of pressure. Same English horn is a little bit bigger, but same concept, as is the bassoon, bigger, same concept, double reed. And then you got clarinet, which is a single reed. All of these reeded instruments have their own different ways of creating sound. And a clarinet is really good at sneaking in almost inaudibly. It's amazing. And depending on the notes for bassoon and oboe, it can be, and I think other notes can be really, really challenging. And the same thing with the flute. Like we can sneak in pretty well. So it's possible, but it's just about controlling the airstream that's going in. Um, some notes are easier than others, of course, but in this, pianissimo for a flute, we can get pretty quiet. I mean, he doesn't orchestrate it in the orchestral version for us in that octave. He always has the flute in the higher octave, which is generally, where we sit in orchestra. So um, is what we get. So we kind of are able to float sort of over the orchestra, which is nice. But I think where he has it for the oboe, I think it's quite tricky for them to get nice and quiet, but I will let an oboist speak to that.
Yeah, great.
It's been a
That's
little time
great.
since I've done that.
Now, okay, another question about the airflow
Mhm.
is I have heard some recordings of pianists playing this much slower than the orchestra.
I would imagine that actually just has to do with Ravel's tempo marking because in the orchestral version it's 120 to the quarter note, and in the
Yeah,
piano version it's 92.
right.
So that's probably it's just like tradition. But I would also say that like obviously Ravel changed his mind, and I don't know if we know why,
Yeah.
but I would say the piano version is very hard to dance to.
Yes.
It's too slow. It's just too slow. And that's okay. Ravel wasn't writing this to dance to, just like Bach wasn't writing his dance suites. They weren't really danceable in the way that other Baroque dance music is. And that's totally fine. But perhaps that's what he was going for as well. It was like a little bit lighter, a little bit more danceable. I love hearing flute music on different instruments because it kind of strips away the baggage that often we get with these very iconic pieces from the canon that we're like, there's one way to do it. And you hear it. Like I heard a flute Bach partita on the saxophone the other day, and I was like, oh, that's how you should play it. Obviously, that's so much better. And like, it doesn't have all of this, years and years of this is one way you should do it, or no, don't do it that way, or this is how someone in a competition said it was okay, but in an audition.
I mean, I think that, this idea of being experimental and creative in how you make sounds, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's so core to like why we're making music, right? And like I'm so happy to hear you talk about how it shouldn't be limited to how this piece was historically done and that's the reason. And it has to be more than that to be fulfilling.
Well, and that's just like a time and place, right? I mean, and we weren't there. We don't know. And I mean, with this, like Ravel, right? He's trying to imagine what he thought Baroque music was. So it's all this kind of like message in a bottle, or like telephone game of like, well, we think that's what it sounded like. And even today, like, we don't really know what it sounded like. And even if we did, we could never experience it or appreciate it the way that musicians did then, because we have 300 years of music that we've heard that would be, I think, very shocking and wonderful to Baroque composers, but very crazy. Because I grew up sort of playing in ensembles and orchestras. So when I'm composing, it's generally very specific, but a lot of what I do is arranging. So I'll take other pieces and then sort of flip them out so that there's that sort of trying to imagine how it could be if you put it through a kaleidoscope.